Welcome to Be Customer Led, where we'll explore how leading experts in customer and employee experience are navigating organizations through their own journey to be customer led and the actions and behaviors employees and businesses exhibit to get there. And now, your host, Bill Staikos.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another week of Be Customer Led. I'm your host, Bill Staikos. I've got a great guest for us this week. Kevin Budelmann is interested in strategic design for business, education, healthcare, and society. Those are really big things for one person to be focused on. Kevin is president and co-founder of Peopledesign, co-founded the company over 20 years ago, I believe, and we'll get into that a little bit. And Peopledesign is a strategy and human-centered design firm based in Michigan. And besides serving as an advisor to clients, Kevin is also an adjunct professor, at Northwestern University and is the former global president of the IXDA, or the Interaction Design Association, which is a great organization, was, I should say, and holds degrees from Carnegie Mellon University, which has an unbelievable design program. I've hired someone out of that program in a past life, and the IIT Institute of Design. And Kevin has a book, Brand Identity Essentials, and it's available not only in 6 languages, but also has a second edition. Kevin, welcome to the show. So excited to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm pleased and honored to be here.
Oh man, I can't. So there's so much to talk to you about. I know we've got about 30 minutes for a show, but I'm curious, you started Peopledesign, over 20 years ago, I believe. Just tell our listeners just a little bit about your story, and because you come from, really big design organizations, and, you've got a fascinating story. So just share it with us for a couple minutes.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. Well, as you mentioned, I went to my undergraduate work at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. And if you're familiar with Carnegie Mellon, it has a good design program, as you mentioned, but it's also a very technology-oriented school. A lot of engineers and computer science. And so, I was exposed pretty early on to not only human-centered design concepts, but a pretty heavy dose of technology as well. And of course, this is sort of early days in interaction design and user experience design and so on. So I think that has sort of fed into my psyche throughout my career. And so, after college, I got a job at Herman Miller, a manufacturer in the Midwest, which is kind of a design leader in the furniture design space, but a more sort of a traditional sense. But that kind of led into this sort of the .com era. And so my experience has been kind of based on this sort of technology front, but then, sort of this more traditional sort of company, sort of manufacturing base in particular, which has been informed my practice. So, and then, so not too long into my career, started this company. I've been doing that for 25 years.
Unbelievable. So tell us a little bit about Peopledesign before we start sort of extracting information from your brain a little bit for listeners. So
Sure.
You work with clients at the intersection of business, brand, service design. So what does that mean, if you can help our listeners and our audience understand that? And how are you working with clients? What's a typical engagement?
Sure. We think about it like this. There's kind of a framework. If you can imagine a 2x2, if you imagine sort of meaning and engagement across the top, and across the side, you can imagine sort of internal and external audiences. And if you think about the intersection of meaning for external audiences like customers, it's brand essentially. And if you think about meaning for internal audiences, it's essentially purpose, right? And you think about the intersection of engagement and customers, it's customer experience, and engagement and internal teams, it's employee experience. So for us, it's just a way to think about kind of these, in our minds, these two kind of macro issues, engagement and meaning. And it kind of overlaps. So our projects are, based on sort of design thinking approaches for the most part, innovation processes that are, established in a lot of places. And we have our own flavor for doing these things, of course. But, it's based on going through kind of methods that to solve kind of strategic problems. And, it can bridge brand issues and customer experience issues. And I think, for us, these things are quite related. That's not always true for everyone, but, for us, it's about connecting those dots.
So I love that. So let's talk about purpose for a second. So I think largely due to the pandemic, not that purpose wasn't important before, but certainly the pandemic really brought that conversation to the fore much more.
Yeah.
Why, help us understand, maybe for sort of the folks that are not in marketing or from an employee experience perspective, talk to us a little about the interconnectivity of purpose and brand, because I think that's a really important one. And there is an intersection there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, there's, for us, what informs our work is the idea of, we think about change and choice. And what I mean by that is all of us are undergoing this sort of macro level of change. I mean, whether it's, technology change, globalization, climate change, these things are informing nearly everybody's work today, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think these changes are forcing organizations to make different kinds of choices. And the landscape continues to kind of shift from kind of let's say, an industrial landscape, which I think had a different set of criteria for success than kind of an information landscape. And so the choices I think organizations have to make have to do with sort of this meaning and engagement, as I mentioned. But as it relates to purpose, I think that, and as you mentioned, like the pandemic, I'm sort of a believer that the pandemic obviously has a lot of unique characteristics, but in many ways, it's also just accelerated trends that were already underway. I mean, so whether it's, working from home, sort of breaking apart sort of the 40-hour work week. I mean, there are lots of things that there were undercurrents of these sort of nascent trends already before the pandemic, and the pandemic had just kind of brought them to the fore. I think as it pertains to purpose, the reason why we talk about meaning is that I think increasingly we talk about, in our organization, kind of an era of choice. We've moved from the industrial landscape was, like I think it was Henry Ford who famously said, you can have any color you want, any color car you want as long as it's black, right?
Yeah, that's right.
The industrial era wasn't about choice. It was just about scale. It was about getting a car into everybody's garage. And now we have many more choices. Consumers have choices, individuals have choices. And, so in our minds, the overlap between brand and purpose, as I mentioned, is meaning. And from our standpoint, the reason why you would choose as a customer to engage with a company and buy their product or engage in their service is very similar to the reason why an employee would want to work there. And we are, for many organizations who are looking for top talent, I mean, the sort of the attraction and retention is a massive issue. And so, from our perspective, these things are, overlap. And I think it's not always intuitive, I think, for people. I think it's like we worked, for example, with a university that was one department that was actually the marketing group recruiting, high school kids into their, undergraduate program. And another department, it wasn't so much attraction and retention, but it was about giving donations to the school, right? So it was sort of fundraising.
Development.
And they had two separate tracks. So again, they often had two separate messages they were launching simultaneously. And we said, look, these things need to be connected. Like the reason you would give money to the school is very related to the reason why you'd send your kid to the school. And I think it's similar for sort of the idea of employee meaning, the employee engagement. Another way to think about sort of purpose. The reason, so I think that the pandemic has just highlighted, as I sort of accelerated these trends and highlighted people's, their ability to make these choices have put the onus on these organizations to be clear about what their purpose actually is.
And that acceleration, I mean, I get that there were some companies certainly before the pandemic that were really getting that. And I think that their message just became even louder, right? Look at, like Patagonia is a great example of that on some level, right? Tesla, even on some level. Why is that so hard to do though, right? Like if a pandemic accelerated that and people are like, oh my gosh, we really got to double down on this effort. Why did it need that pandemic? And I hate to focus on the pandemic because I'm ready to get past it just like everybody else. But why did it take that to wake people up to the fact that more effort needs to be put here, resources, et cetera, in the organization, and cross collaboratively across an organization as well? Is it just because it's hard work and different groups need to come together? Is it people weren't really seeing the need for it, or what's your take on that? I'm curious.
I mean, my feeling is that because it's an accelerant, we move from a state where it was kind of the proverbial, frog in the water that's slowly getting warmer and starts to boil. I mean, what happens is that, it's hard to see changes when they're slow moving, and organizations and people resist change. I mean, I feel like in some respects, we're sort of in the change business, which is to say helping organizations navigate these macro changes. So what is the impact on their organization? And so I think that the extent to which the pandemic just had this sudden change, I think it was very jarring. But again, some of these trends you could have predicted and kind of were already underway. But it just it forced the issue, right? So Simon Sinek has been out talking about start with why for some time. So it's not like the purpose discussion was already kind of out there, but it was easy to see as kind of more superfluous in some cases. Some people would say like, that sounds cool, or let's talk about that when it comes to recruiting, or like we got to get those millennials in here or whatever it is. But I mean, I think what's happened now is that you're having direct conflicts with key employees saying, I don't think I want to go back to the office, or I would like to start working from some other city. And, if you don't accept my terms, Mr. or Miss Employer, I'll just find another employer who's willing to accept those conditions. And even some of the best employers in the world, I mean, it's like, I think Apple famously is, I think they've made 2 or 3 announcements about everybody coming back to their huge, beautiful campus that, people are not necessarily wanting to do that. Some of their really important people. And so I think everyone is starting to, it's forcing an organization to be a little bit clear about why should you work for this organization? Obviously there's money, but getting over this, the obstacle of, thinking about purpose it can be hard, because in part, as I mentioned, I think that for a lot of organizations that were, I think, born out of, let's say the late stage kind of industrial era, where you're just, there's a lot of sort of fast follower kind of models where it's just like, we don't really have a purpose so much as we're going to copy that company and do it like slightly better, we hope, that's not much of a purpose ultimately in terms of trying to attract a really talented person who says like, look, join our, get on board with our mission.
I worked for a bank at one point not too long ago where their new mantra was being customer obsessed. I'm like, I've heard this one before. I wonder where that comes from. But it almost, to your point though, it fell hollow on a lot of folks because the organization was not giving them the tools, the resources, the platforms to be able to be customer obsessed, much like an Amazon does in so many different ways. And it was tough for folks to say, okay, I want to be there. I hear you, but we're not getting there because you can't do X, Y, and Z. That same institution, by the way, is telling people to come back to the office no matter what. I do wonder sometimes, and I see this a lot purely more on the customer experience side. And I wonder if it's sometimes due to, in a lot of places, your customer experience function could be different or not connected to your marketing function as well. Like there's so much out there that is also confusing, I think. And people are just kind of like just working in their lanes. Are you seeing a shift there as well? And maybe that's driven by the pandemic or otherwise, but in your work and the clients that you're working with, are they trying to get to a place where they can employ sort of service design or human-centered design tools in a much more integrated and cross-functional way? Or are they still in, okay, we want to do this, but we want marketing to do their job and, CX to do their job and finance to do their job, et cetera?
Yeah. I mean, I think everybody is in their own sort of state of evolution in a sense, right? I mean, and so one of the things that we overtly try to do in initial engagement with a new customer is try to understand where they're coming from. And there are all these signals in terms of how do they describe their functions and departments? What terms do they use? And just even, what do these ideas mean to them? Do they have this mature practice, or are they just learning about it on sort of a more basic level? And which isn't to say that we have it all figured out. I mean, I think all of us, and yourself included, right? I think these are new topics, frankly. I think that I've sort of developed kind of a philosophy that we sort of have drawn our departmental boundaries kind of in the wrong places in part. I think that, again, it's a bit of an industrial paradigm. I think we've had, every organization has its silos, right? Where marketing is a silo and customer service is a silo and sales is a silo and operations is a silo. And it's understandable why. And because I actually think that, again, sort of the industrial mindset is almost like you think about it as an assembly line, literally, right? So you can move from one department to another.
Yeah.
And of course, if you look at it through the lens of a customer, they don't care which department is making these things happen. They just have an experience and they have an impression.
Yeah.
And so I think it's reorienting an organization to start thinking this way. And I think while it's very popular and has been for the last, nearly my whole career to talk about cross-functional teams, I think that the reality for most people in a corporate environment is that the combination of shared calendaring and cross-functional teams means that everybody's in meetings all the time, and
Yeah,
right, which I don't know if that's effective either, right?
that's right.
I mean, so I think that you see the emergence of different kinds of disciplines. So I think the idea of talking about customer experience as an example is just saying that having a department or having a person, a leader in that space is at least planting a flag to say this is an important thing to actually think about. Now, what that actually means on the ground for an organization, and depending on its scale, can vary.
So I'm seeing a lot more. I feel like we went from departmental silos to being, they're called product-led organizations, right? That kind of feels like it's the new big kind of term. The ones that are getting it more and maybe taking it from product to something new is really being much more journey driven, and even organizing that way. Do you see something different? Like when you the clients that you're working with that are just completely enlightened by this stuff, how are they organized for success? Because I'm always fascinated by how do you go from purpose to an actual product or service to employees actually knowing what they're supposed to do and deliver that with excellence every day and wanting to, right? Because they're connected to that purpose. And then the customer even there. And that may lead into my next question a little bit, but what kind of models are you seeing the companies that are getting it right? What are they doing differently organizationally?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's interesting. I had a colleague of mine who was actually head of the global design team at IBM, and he was describing for me how, part of his objective was to basically create design leadership at the GM level within each of these sort of macro parts of the organization to kind of ride alongside the business lead to sort of evangelize these ideas. So I think he saw his role as kind of an evangelist, essentially. I think that there are different kinds of structures. I think that one of the indicators are whether or not people are investing in this in the first place. But I think there's a lot of dialogue about, at least in the design world, they talk about design ops has become increasingly this term du jour, right? Or just even having a customer experience group or a leader in that space. Yeah. I think there are different models. My belief is that a lot of it should be journey based. I think that, the way we connect these ideas too is to think about it as, if you think about a brand or a value proposition as a kind of promise, that you're staking a claim in the marketplace about we're going to represent this to our customers or our stakeholders or our employees for that matter. The journey, the actual experience, is the way you're delivering on that promise. And in my mind, it's like nearly everything the organization does should be in service of delivering on that promise. Now, how that happens under the hood, it can vary based on, there are complexities. I think about it as a systems design problem in a sense, because there's, there are digital interactions, there are physical interactions, there are personal interactions, some combination of these things. There are new opportunities with new technology to convert physical ones to become digital ones. There may be price reasons to do that, also data mining reasons to do it. Sure. So there's this continued flow, but I think, the journey, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's sort of an endless, trying to put yourself in the customer's shoes, right? I mean, this is the whole, it's like there's kind of a, trying to get people to buy into the philosophy so you can actually get into the practice. Yeah,
interesting. Where I am at Medallia, there's a lot of conversation among organizations about connecting that purpose right down and, through brand into the experience that's being delivered. This is really hard work, by the way. Like it's not, it's not like, hey, we're going to do this and in 6 months, we're going to get this mostly. What questions should folks be asking themselves to understand that connection and maybe even get to start doing the work? I feel like I'm a big believer in trying to understand, like, okay, not just what is a problem, but what are the right questions that we should be asking ourselves as a business? What are some of the things that maybe you're bringing to the conversation with clients and asking them that they should start to be thinking about and answering as an organization to be able to start to connect those things through?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because I think, the starting place is always this question of like looking at the customer first and being customer centered in the first place or user centered. And I think for people who have been in this practice for a long time, it seems obvious. But as I say, I just literally had an experience not too long ago with an executive, and it was funny. I was on one of their jet, corporate jet things, or we're flying around, and I just kind of made this, so you got to look at the customer and you have to flip it around. You basically have to, and it was like a light bulb opening for him. Like he just literally had never really thought of it. So in a way, that's basic. But then, it goes from there. I think there are lots of tenets, like, one of them that we sort of subscribe to is the idea of that organizations need to absorb complexity. I think that one of the industrial paradigms that we've all become accustomed to, whether it's through Six Sigma and the quality movement, is sort of, and even like the outsourcing movement, like where basically you stick to your core competency and you outsource all the other complexity. Yeah. Well, what's happened is that I think that there's an argument that can be made that to create better, and often that means simpler experiences for the customer, the organization has to deliberately take on more complexity, which, is almost like, for a lot of organizations that they're designed to repel that, almost like a disease, right? That they don't want to take on any more complexity because it just means cost, and they're always trying to whittle down cost. But in order to create that better experience, there has to be a deliberate kind of an understanding and a belief that they need to take on additional things in order to make it easier for that customer. So as an example, I think that there are sort of lenses that you can look at these things to try to think about the customer experience. We wrote a piece not long ago on, like 25 lenses for a customer experience as an example, just as a way to look at this journey and from a variety of different ways, looking at it in terms of inputs and outputs, looking at it as a story arc, looking at it as, time increments, interactions along the way. What are the incremental stuff versus the small pictures versus the big pictures? So, there's a lot to be done, as you well know, in this space, but so much of it is like getting people on board, like sort of conceptual, like what are we actually trying to achieve here in terms of and again, it's like we want to be meaningful. We have to engage these people in order to engage them. And there's a lot in our minds baked into those words. I mean, you have to know who's on the other side of the table, which kind of implies user research and customer research. So
yeah, I do think sometimes, and this is really hard to do still, even because the technology doesn't exist to be able to do it on some level, but connecting the employee journey and the customer journey to understand the impact and the flow that way. You can do that with data on some level, right? Like what are the behaviors that drive, better journeys and sort of in the moment, et cetera. But I think we're probably like a couple of years off from like truly being able to connect the two and understand the impact of these. I want to take it down maybe into service design and just kind of keep on kind of going down the layers here a little bit.
Sure.
How would you characterize service design differently than other design work, perhaps? Just there may be listeners that aren't familiar with the term.
Sure.
And why is it important in the context of customer experience, or even perhaps, like big CX, right? As we call it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's, and I'm sure you could fill in also a lot of these blanks, I'm sure, but I think that in my experience, there's a lot, because so many of these disciplines are emerging still and kind of being defined on the fly, and we'll all be reading a book that it's being written right now, probably next year, right? So, and I think it's because there are new things, there's a lot of new ideas emerging, but as a result, there's not always an agreement even on terms, I believe. So one of the basics is even, customer versus user, right? User language comes more usually from the design world, and it's a bit more of there's an implication about usability and, sort of user-centeredness in that sense. And whereas obviously customer has this implication about the business objective and profitability, let's say. Yeah. And of course, I've worked with organizations who see almost these two things as sort of almost like internally they're enemies, right? Like the people who are advocating for the users aren't, they don't like the marketing people and vice versa. And obviously the organizations who can make these things work together are the ones who are going to succeed. So anyway, to answer your question more directly, I think the term service design, again, design is, in my experience, has been more common in Europe. It's pretty well understood. In fact, I was just talking to a client of ours who's based in Europe, and part of the question for the project advocate was saying, how come I can't find any service designers in North America? They're trying to hire in North America.
Interesting.
And I said, it's because people don't use that term here. That's part of my answer, right? I mean, people use other words. They talk about user experience, or they talk about, customer experience. Yeah. But of course, I don't mean to, trivialize the fact that those terms that also imply that people are coming from very different worlds sometimes, right? I mean, they might be coming from, the hospitality world and customer service world
Mm,
and have nothing to do with design at all.
correct.
And then other people are looking at it from kind of a user, so it's kind of top down, bottom up in a sense. But so I think, I think people can debate about the difference between, let's say, service design versus customer experience. I mean, it's kind of like service design is an activity to work on that journey. Customer experience is a philosophy of looking at the whole umbrella. They very much overlap, and people would debate, just like people would debate maybe even the difference between user experience and customer experience. But like, at what point is the customer a user or the user a customer? I mean, at some point we're kind of, splitting hairs in my view anyway. But
I agree. I think that we generally have, and towards the top of the show, we talked a little bit about this, but like, we've put a lot of complexity, and I don't know who started this or like where it started, but there was so much complexity. And I think your point around agreeing on the language and the terms that we're going to use as an organization have always started there first. Like, what do you think customer experience means? Let's start defining that and putting structure around that. And then what are the different tools that we're going to use to be able to get there, right? And then what does that mean for different teams even as well? I think getting that common language is super important. I just don't, and I'm going to be critical of maybe, and I shouldn't do this, but of big CX, like, we don't do that well enough. And you're right. Like, there's always this practice is evolving and continues to evolve. Maybe that's part of it, but I really do think that creating your own lexicon for your company, whatever that makes sense, right? And then applying the different tools and whatever those make sense as you're trying to accomplish a goal for that user, for that customer, for that business or employee, I think is an excellent point, a really important one. I'm really curious of people, like, who do you admire in your space and why? Like, who do you look up to? Because many, like, you're an adjunct, you've run your own business. Obviously, you've got great content out there, and we'll talk about where to go, folks can go find it, et cetera. But like, who do you look up to in this space, Kevin?
It's interesting. I think the longer I do it, the more the people I look up to are not in the space, in a sense. I mean, which isn't to say I don't admire people. I mean, I'm like everyone, probably. I'm skimming through all the business books and all the latest. Everybody is coming in. I've got a stack here of service design books just to like wrap my head around how that's being discussed. And of course, what happens is that, the terms are, I guess maybe my bias or my belief that there's so many of these concepts overlapping. I mean, every book has its own version on how to do research and so on. Yeah. So I admire, it's easy for me to admire, the kind of the canons in the business world anyway, Drucker and Warren Buffett and, or even, more contemporary Jobs or Elon Musk, or even more recently, it's like a Bob Iger from Disney. But, and then of course there are lots of, peers and authors and people in the space. But, as I look at, I even kind of drills back even to my first experience at Herman Miller, one of the early leaders, a guy named Max Dupree, wrote a book called Leadership is an Art, and talks about how the purpose of a leader is to, define reality and say thank you, which I think is, so to me, the extent to which we attempt to bring in a level of leadership to our clients. I mean, I'm interested in the practice, don't get me wrong, but I also feel like, I think, the longer I go in my career, it's this bigger picture that can help. And if you can help shape that sort of, as Max was saying, sort of define reality, it's a way to kind of move things forward in a different way. So presenting a point of view to get there. I mean, there's a lot obviously to do when it comes down to on the practitioner level, but that's going to continue to evolve. And there's, it's also, it also sometimes feels like every idea, every new idea is just kind of borrowed from a previous version of it that was 20 years ago. So which isn't to say there aren't new ideas. It's just that it's an evolving school of thought, and as people develop new ways of thinking about sort of, a new context.
I love define reality and say thank you. That really feels like it just really encapsulates like servant leadership on some level too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Where do you go for inspiration, Kevin?
Well, again, I'm a big fan of all the usual kind of suspects, probably. I mean, Simon Sinek or Dan Pink or Scott Galloway, people like this. But for me, I guess for I get increasingly intrigued by, people, it's amazing how fluid we can get, how fluidly we can get access to podcasters and so on, things like this, right? So I mean, somebody like a Sam Harris, because of his sort of clarity of thought and sort of the focus on, incentives and outcomes and things that, I find that, to be really fascinating. Or even Yuval Noah Harari, I think his name is, familiar with him, but he's a historian essentially, right? But I guess for me, again, the extent to which, kind of circling back to the top, is I think about kind of the macro changes. Yeah. He's one of the most articulate people talking about the really seismic changes that are affecting us as a culture and what businesses are dealing with. Whether we sort of, they're almost tectonic level changes that I think aren't easily identifiable, but if you start to recognize them, you can see how they kind of have impacts on nearly every organization today. So I'm sure you've had the same kind of experience. It's if we can get down to the root of the problem, it's a little bit easier to break loose in terms of helping to reorient organizations.
You mentioned Scott. I actually had Scott Galloway as my brand professor at Stern.
Oh, did you really? Awesome.
In my MBA, yeah.
Yeah.
He doesn't return my emails anymore, but that's okay. I don't take offense to it.
Yeah, it's a bigger deal, I guess.
Right? Yeah, much bigger deal. Kevin, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, talking to us just about the connectivity between purpose and down to the experience. And I think it's just a topic that a lot of folks are struggling with today. So hopefully,
thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Oh man, the pleasure is all mine and ours. And look, hey, where can people find you if they want to get in touch or learn more about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, the easiest spot is my firm, Peopledesign.com. I'm in a number of other places, but that's the best starting place. You can find our book and consulting and all the rest of the things we do there.
Very cool. Very cool. Thanks again. All right, everybody. Great show. We're out. Talk to you soon, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Be Customer Led with Bill Staikos. We are grateful to our audience for the gift of their time. Be sure to visit us at becustomerled.com for more episodes. Leave us feedback on how we're doing or tell us what you want to hear more about. Until next time, we're out.